Welcome to episode 206 of Studio Talent Collective, the podcast. Today, I think we need to speak about how we can be stuck on repeat. Stuck on repeat with old studio strategies that are no longer getting results, or they aren't getting any new results. And this is that rinse, repeat, regret. Rinse, repeat, regret. Rinse, repeat, regret. Does anyone feel me? Look, I want you to be able to break free. I want you to break free from these outdated studio habits that you may have within your business. So we're going to talk about how we can identify those patterns, understanding what used to work versus what may work for you now, the consequences of ignoring those customer needs, and more. We want to talk about how so many studio owners can find themselves stuck in a rut, And I think that this is important because sometimes we stop listening to our audience, to our customers, our students, our clients, our studio families. And instead we just do what we've always done, or even if it's not been going on for too long, like maybe you've always just done this thing or run this program or, communicated something in a particular way and it's worked for you for a while until it doesn't work anymore. Or maybe it never worked, but you just don't want to listen. You don't want to listen to what the people are saying, whether they're saying it directly or indirectly, okay? So we want to break that rinse, repeat, regret cycle. Let's talk about that.
I'm Josephine Lane-Cuba and welcome to Studio Talent Collective, the podcast for dance and performing arts studio owners. Here we share industry insights, inspiring stories, and real talk to help you build a thriving studio and in-house talent agency. As a performing arts business coach and talent agent, I'm all about dreaming big and growing together as a community. You're in the right place. Let's leap in.
Now, today's episode, I was inspired. I was talking to a client of mine and they were talking about, how they'd been using particular subscriptions or licenses for particular programming, preschool programming, etc. in their studio, and they've just always done it, but they're not finding that it's actually generating additional income or students or enrollments. But they're just, in this rut of doing what they've always done, right? And so I think that, it's hard sometimes to break the cycle or stop something that you've done for a long time, or accept that maybe it's time to move on. But this conversation that I actually had with this studio owner client of mine was something that sparked this episode and inspired me. And I think it's really important, first and foremost, that when it comes to this rinse and repeat, where you are stuck on repeat in your business or in a particular program or offer, is to really identify that pattern, identify that it's actually happening. Now, why some studio owners tend to repeat the same strategies even when results are stalling. Look, there's a lot of reasons for that. And some of it comes down to comfort. Sometimes it just feels easier and less risky to stick with what we've always done, right? So even when deep down we know it might not be working for us anymore. And so, like I said, that comfort factor could just be tradition, or maybe it's fear of change or something else that keeps us stuck. So I think it's about identifying what it is that's keeping us stuck, And let's get honest with ourselves, are we clinging to routines because they're familiar, or are we genuinely seeing results from them? Right now, in your head, you might be driving, you might be on a walk, you might be, wherever. In the studio, you might be at home lying on the couch, wherever you are. I want you to just take a beat and really think about what's something within your studio business or even life where you feel like you're just stuck. You're in rinse and repeat mode, and maybe it's not actually getting those results anymore, or maybe it never was. So identify it, right? That's the first step. And, I think next you need to understand what used to work. Understanding what used to work that may not be working anymore. So can you think of things that brought lots of enrollment or engagement several years ago, for example, but flopped today? Maybe it was several months ago even. I mean, with the, AI powered this and AI powered that and social media and all of the things that we deal with within business nowadays, things are constantly evolving. So what was working, what was, getting you enrollments and engagement several months ago, several years ago, maybe it was 5 years ago, but is a flop today whenever you do it. And what once packed out your classes may barely move the needle now, right? So I want you to think about those old tricks and, those old tricks you keep reaching for, and how might those tried and true methods have lost their magic? Like, have they lost their magic? And just be honest with yourself. Sometimes it's not about the method, but about how your families have changed and their needs have changed. Sometimes people just need something new to feel excited about. I mean, I talk about this with talent agency stuff, having an in-house talent agency can, rejuvenate a studio business and bring back that excitement. But whatever it is for your studio business, what can you do to reignite the excitement? It could be the programming, I think, as well, like identifying what your customers are into. It could even just be within the programming that you have now, like a jazz class, for example. You might be rinse and repeating the same choreography. Actually, this was another thing that, like I mentioned in the intro or whatever, when I was talking to that studio owner client of mine, they were talking about particular events that they've been going to, like, different conferences and different expos and different, workshops across Australia. And a lot of the choreographers are rinse and repeating their routines. So you might go to one conference and do a dance class, and it's the same instructors that are at all the other conferences and they're all doing the same exact routine that they did, over here and over there and 6 months ago over there. And it's just like, we have to question that, don't we? We have to question that. People expect more these days. And when you're working for the same audience, can you truly rinse and repeat everything? For example, oh my gosh, years ago, it was so different. My sister went to a dance studio and they honestly did the same routines in the concert year after year. Not all of them, but some of them. And they used the same costumes every year. And I'm not saying you shouldn't rinse or repeat tried and true methods. You absolutely should. Sometimes the boring business is a great business, right? But you need to identify when it's not working or when it's time to give your clients a little bit more. Like, again, that whole, same choreographer at every event doing the same routine they did at every other event, give people something new, and that's the thing. Obviously, you don't want to fix what's not broken, rather. So you don't want to break what works. You don't want to fix what's not broken, right? If it ain't broke, don't fix it. That saying, right? But yeah, just thinking about that a little bit more closely. Look, there are definitely consequences when it comes to ignoring your customer needs. So for example, like I said, I'm using this case study, I suppose, my studio owner client talking about how they've, been to all the events and these conference events and workshops with their students, and it's all the same routines and teachers, no matter which state they go to, right? And so now they're thinking they're not going to book next time. That's a consequence. Repeat business. So, why is it so easy to dismiss feedback from customers, students, and families? Sometimes feedback can sting or feel real inconvenient. So we avoid it. But doing so makes it easy to really miss opportunities for real growth. Sometimes you might be super surprised by what your students or families actually want versus what you believe they need, and I'll bet you've, had moments where your assumptions were totally off base from what your customers are actually craving. This can happen. So more so if you do ignore those changing needs, you're going to get more drop-offs, people unenrolling, disengagement, less repeat customers, negative word of mouth. So you really want to ignore these shifts, meaning, you don't want to risk low enrollment, unhappy customers. And ultimately, a weaker community vibe in your studio, bring back the joy, bring the fun, inject excitement. That's what's going to make you stand out from the crowd, truly. Now, there are some, new behaviors and motivations in the marketplace right now. I mean, we all know we've got inflation is one of them. Okay, sure. People are just generally exhausted and tired. It's that post-COVID trauma, and I believe that is a real thing, and people are exhausted. We're also exhausted by the hustle, social media culture, more hustle, woo. I think generally people have cottoned onto it, that hustle culture, and I think people are over it, to be honest. I really do. I think people are moving away from it. So you're seeing people more exhausted in your customer base. They're more exhausted, less responsive. They want to spend less money. They want to gain back their time. So you need to ask yourself, how have the motivations for your clients or potential students changed over the last couple of years or even the last couple of months? There are social media, there's technology, there's a wide cultural shift that's happening. Your clientele might have totally changed. And that's okay, but it's about finding ways to speak to your new audience. So instead of, always drumming the same beat, which is a lot of studios talk about, building confidence, making friendships, developing new skills, right? These are the constants that all studio owners use in their marketing techniques. What about how you actually save the parents' energy and time? How does that work? Well, drop your kids off with us for a couple of hours and go get your grocery shopping done in peace and quiet without the kids hanging off your back. Change the message or add to the message. Yes, confidence, friendship, and all those typical threads that all other studios use. Yeah, sure, great. But what else can you do to stand out? Talking to the new client, the new behavior, the new motivation. Are you sick and tired of having your kids at home on screens? Try this instead. Be a great parent. Send them to dance. And it's about having a different way of speaking to your audience. That's all it's really about, honestly. I think it's about shifting that message and moving with the times and the people that you serve. So, the way people find, share, and talk about your studio is definitely shifting, and it's shifting fast. So how are you going to keep up with the trend? That's what I would be asking myself right now as a studio owner, okay? Another point that I've written here that I really want to talk about is, listen, don't prescribe. So what's the difference between listening for feedback or just defending your decisions? Yeah. Now, don't get me wrong. You can't listen to everything that drops into your inbox. I totally get it. There's nothing worse than especially like after show season, and you've done this big mammoth effort to put on a show, and then the next day or even that night you get an email from one disgruntled parent out of several hundred, by the way, one disgruntled parent because, I don't know, you didn't have a system for where the kids put their shoes and little Johnny lost a ballet slipper, and they are so angry about it and they want their money for the ballet slipper. Who knows what people complain about? Or grandma didn't get the seat that she booked and there was a double booking in the audience. Whatever, right? There's so many things that can go wrong. So many little tiny details of an event, but it can be difficult to manage. So you don't want to be listening to all of the naysayers, but listen with an open heart and an open mind when people give you feedback. Because, are you truly hearing people's concerns, or are you just jumping in to justify your own choices and doing the same old thing? Rinse, repeat, regret. Yeah? When did you last actually ask families what they're hoping for? And really listen. Do you do surveys? Have you sat down and had a conversation? Do you ask people questions? Do you read the feedback from the feedback forms? You know, like, are you doing your due diligence when it comes to listening to your customers? Are you curious? You know, having curious conversations with your community. I like to have curious conversations with my community. I recently got a call actually from a talent agent who didn't like something I said, particularly in one of my reels. And so I thought, that's interesting. They didn't like how I positioned something in my marketing. So I asked the question to one of my clients. I said, hey, just wanting to know, do you feel this way about XYZ? Which was part of my marketing content. And they said, yes, absolutely. This is what, it wasn't a leading question either. I asked them a question that wasn't leading, and I asked them, is that, like, what is your experience in this? And they totally backed what I'd said in my marketing message. And then I reminded myself, who am I speaking to as, someone who works with studios to create talent agencies? Am I speaking to other talent agents, or am I speaking to the people I serve? And so I'm going to listen to my customers and not to the naysayers outside of that, because that's my job, like to listen to my customers and block out the external noise from people that aren't even the people I serve. Remember that. That's another bit. Who is the feedback coming from? That's a key question to ask yourself. But hey, at the end of the day, this is all experimental. You can experiment, you can adjust, you can evolve, you can change, maneuver. It could be as simple as tweaking your schedule, or as bold as adding a new program or service, or, putting a talent agency in your studio. Like, how do your people respond when you experiment, adjust, and evolve? You can start with things that are low risk experiments. Like adding a class onto the timetable, doing a trial workshop to see if people are interested, or putting register your interest form out for a particular offer. That's an idea. So, that's what you want to be doing. You want to be experimenting with these new concepts and not rinse and repeating and regretting. Yeah. I always think we often regret the things we didn't do more than the things that we did do. So, get in there. You want to let go of those what I call legacy habits, So there might be a program, a policy, or a tradition that needs to be reconsidered, but you haven't been brave enough yet. But I'm giving you permission. Give yourself permission, to be brave. So what's one thing you could keep doing just because it's always been done? Or what could you change? Ask yourself that. Sometimes I get it, holding on to those legacy habits or practices can make you feel safe, but other times it makes you feel stagnant. Can be a security blanket, or it could be quietly holding you back. So, this is a call out to all the studio owners listening here today to phase out what's no longer working for you. It doesn't have to be a sudden stop. It could be a gentle letting go. It could be that you don't have the capacity to teach all the classes that you're teaching anymore in order to grow your business, and you have to step out of the classroom a bit. That could be really hard to let go of. But it might be something you need to do, or that will help you grow. Maybe it could be hiring a new staff member. Maybe it could be implementing a new service. So I want you to start planning how you can transition away from the old to create space for the new. That's what this is about. Don't forget that very first step at the beginning of this episode, and that is the key critical one, and that is to identify what the habit is. And just pick something. Pick one thing to let go of and one thing to try based on what your customers are saying, or you think is going to really improve your studio business. Hold yourself accountable. Just pick one thing to let go of and one thing to try after you identify what needs to change. All right, thank you so much to all of you for listening to this episode. I hope it's been helpful. Let's no longer rinse, repeat and regret. Let's break free from those outdated studio habits. Have a beautiful day.
This episode is brought to you by Studio Talent Collective, helping you go from studio owner to talent manager with confidence. Ready to start your own in-house talent agency? Connect with me at josephinelancuba.com or via the links in the show notes. If you enjoyed this episode, please share, rate, and review. Thanks for listening and keep shining.